Hey guys, picture this. You're jolting down a narrow, rock-strewn trail aboard a rattling wooden stagecoach, your hopes higher than your brimmed hat, until you realize the racket up ahead isn't a herd stampede, but a quartet of armed desperados with more rust on their rifles than manners in a saloon. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Part 1, the setup, a terrifyingly mundane beginning. You wake up before sunrise in a ramshackle wooden inn, the kind of place where the floors creak louder than the ghost stories whispered around the taproom hearth. You've paid your fare for a stagecoach ride to the bustling boomtown of Calico Junction. Population around 1,200 swindlers, prostitutes, gold-digging prospectors, and grieving widows, some of whom are one and the same. In your knapsack, a pack of stale hardtack, a half-pound chunk of beef jerky, harder than frontier justice, and a wad of bills that you definitely didn't earn honestly. Step 1 of any stagecoach journey, pretending you're excited. You jab your finger at the coach's ornately carved door and hoist yourself up like you're the hero in some dime novel epic, until your spurs clang so loudly that every bystander within earshot both glares at you and quietly thanks you for reminding them they aren't the only sore traveler in the world. The coach driver, a gaunt fellow named Silas Two Fingers Cartwright, his name because he lost the digits in a poker game that went very wrong, tips his battered Stetson. His other hand grips the reins and his eyes narrow each time your elbow threatens to spill that precious beef jerky onto his precious harness. Accompanying him is his shotgun-toting sidekick, Maribel Maria Mayhem Mendoza, who looks like she swallowed a thundercloud and then decided to wear it. The horses paw the dusty earth with hooves that could crush skulls if they were so inclined, but today they're content to chew straw and occasionally flick their tails at flies. Your fellow passengers are a delightful assortment of Western cliches, an overeager gold prospector rattling off tales of striking it rich, in veins the size of telephone poles, a downtrodden schoolteacher clutching a dusty primer even though her highest level lesson might involve teaching bees to read, and a snooty banker whose polished boots make you want to spit in the dust. They've all boarded under the assumption that the West is a place of freedom, opportunity, and mild inconveniences. Little do they know, though, that the day ahead holds the crawling grip of existential terror, first order of business, the scenic route to paranoia. As the sun claws its way above the horizon, the stagecoach lurches forward. You bump along the dusty washboard path like a tumbleweed in a blender, each jolt reminding you that your spine is not an infinite resource. The wind whips your hair, or lack thereof, into a frenzied dance, sending plumes of dust into your nostrils that will taste like regret for the next 3 years. Silas hums an off-key tune about outlaws he's chased but never quite caught, and Maria Mayhem taps rhythmically against the barrel of her shotgun, like a drumbeat heralding doom. The hills on either side of the path grow steeper, their jagged silhouettes resembling the teeth of some ancient beast lying in wait. If you squint, you might see vultures in the distance, either feasting on roadkill or scouting for fresh misfortune. And that, my friends, is precisely when you realize you've forgotten to pack extra socks. In the Old West, blisters are the charming souvenirs you never ask for. Yet even with flaming arches of feet agony radiating upward, you have no incentive to hop down and dance a jig for relief because the horizon looks suspiciously like it may sprout bandits at any moment. The psychological warfare of ignorance. Banditry in the Old West doesn't arrive with trumpets and a red carpet, it creeps into your very thoughts. Every rustle in the underbrush, every sudden gust that rattles the coach windows, feels like a harbinger of doom. The prospector's rattling pan sounds like the clatter of a shotgun cocking. The schoolteacher's gentle humming becomes a siren song, luring you into a goldless pit. And the banker's soft snores? They echo like the hollow drumbeat of imminent robbery. What you don't realize yet is that stagecoach robberies are less about fireworks and more about theater. The bandits won't just ride up, empty your pockets, and ride off. No, they've perfected the art of psychological humiliation. It's a brutal performance. The lead outlaw saunters up, tips his hat, and greets you with a cheery, "Morning, friend. Mind handing over your valuables?" As if you're sharing your lunch, not your life savings. They'll make polite conversation, pass the time swapping jokes about how you astronauts of civilization ended up in their dusty little corner of sin, all while patting down your coat for anything worth saloon keeping. Lesson 2. The anatomy of a robbery. Robberies had protocols, much like gentlemen's duels, except instead of fine turnout, they involved bandanas soaked with more sweat than good intentions. Here's a quick breakdown of the players. The lookout, perched 200 yards away on a rocky outcrop, monikered Eagle Eye for his supremely misplaced confidence. He watches for riders from the Wells Fargo Express or lawmen because nothing says trust us like an unshakable loyalty to an outlaw crew. The enforcer, the one with the shotgun, often a woman because society decided it was acceptable for ladies to wield punctuation marks, but apparently not double-barreled murder machines, so outlaw crews flip the script. That'd be Maria Mayhem in our scenario, cruelly efficient and eager to remind you that second chances were rarer than clean water in the desert. The boss, always someone with a twirling mustache, a penchant for dramatic flair, and a portfolio of petty crimes that would make your granddad blush. He strides up to the stagecoach with measured steps, tipping his hat with one hand while nonchalantly keeping a pistol trained on your knees with the other. On this particular morning, as your breath still fogs your eyeballs in the chilly air, you hear the distant crunch of hooves. The horses under the unbroken dead weight of the pack horse are retrained by a belligerent "Whoa" from Silas. You brace yourself. The dramatic pause, 50 words of suspense. Silence envelopes the coach. The wind dies. Even the vultures hold their circles as if too bored or too polite to interrupt. You can feel the world tightening, like a noose, only with fewer redeeming features. And then a voice crackles through the quiet. Well, well, well. It looks like the bank decided to send us a treasure chest today. When you open the coach door, you'll wish you hadn't. Physical comedy meets mortal peril. Step 3 in the plan, keep the victims pliable. The boss insists everyone remains seated and hands forward, even though you might be shy 2 limbs after falling off the coach. He casually strolls from seat to seat, patting your hat, tipping his imaginary hat, and reminding you to keep your hands where he can see them, because a clean getaway depends on you not throwing any sudden fits of bravery. As he rummages through your pockets, you flash back to that questionable bet you made in Kansas City, the one involving a blindfolded arm wrestling contest. You thank the cosmos you didn't bet your watch, because not only has that sucker vanished, it might now be strapped to an outlaw's waist as a reward for punctuality. Every stolen possession is cataloged with meticulous care. The boss loudly reads off your valuables as if announcing lottery winners, each tally marking a blow to your pride. $1 gold, nice try, pal. 2 bullets and a half-eaten beef jerky stick. My, I do love a snack. Meanwhile, Maria Mayhem stands guard, her shotgun resting on your kneecap like an unwelcome bookmark. You wonder if she ever says please. The soundtrack of your own ruin. In the midst of this circus, there's the soundtrack. The whip crack of leather from the driver's lash, the rasp of the outlaw's coat sleeve across the coach's wooden paneling, the distant bleat of a mountain goat that may or may not be cheering your demise. You can't decide if you want to laugh or cry, so you do both. A gasp from the school teacher echoes in the coach, followed by a polite, "Oh dear," and then a hiss from the prospector, "Doggone these varmints." The banker, trying desperately to maintain decorum, adjusts his tie and lifts a trembling finger. "Sir, may I please arrange a promissory note?" The boss chuckles. "Sweetheart, the only note you're arranging is a restraining order. Against us." Why you're doomed, even after the robbery. Here's the kicker. Surviving the robbery doesn't mean you survive the aftermath. Once the outlaws depart, you're left in the middle of nowhere. The coach, bereft of valuables, turns into a glorified prop. The horses lope away with the robbers, leaving you with your own 2 feet and 3 fractured ribs, at least. The driver, who's far more concerned about his harness than your spleen, instructs you to trudge on foot toward the nearest town, a vaguely defined spot that might or might not have medical care. As you stagger down the trail, each step is a reminder that in the Old West, kindness was as scarce as a cloudless sky in July. You're a half-mile from anywhere, sun blistering your back, dust clogging your throat, and your morale lower than a rattlesnake's belly. You'll survive this, sure, because you have no choice, but not without collecting a bounty of scars, regrets, and a newfound appreciation for modern transportation. That, friends, is why you wouldn't survive a stagecoach robbery in the Old West. To be continued in part 2, where we explore the bitter taste of cattle trough water, the mesmerizing dullness of frontier justice, and the galling realization that gold dust doesn't pay medical bills. Welcome back. Hope you've recovered from our little excursion into brigandish hospitality. If you missed part 1, catch up before you ruin the surprise of how badly things go downhill. Now, dim the lights, cue the tumbleweed waltz, and brace yourself for part 2 of why you absolutely wouldn't survive a stagecoach robbery in the Old West. Part 2, the aftermath, when survival feels like a series of unfortunate events. You've staggered away from the scene of the crime, your newfound bruise art supply courtesy of Maria Mayhem's shotgun barrel, and your dignity scattered among the sagebrush. Now you're hiking towards civilization, which sounds idyllic until you remember that civilization is a dusty speck on the horizon that may or may not have a chiropractor. Your ribs throb in Morse code for abandon all hope, and every breath reminds you that lungs were designed to inflate, not explode. Scene 1, the water trap. After what feels like 3 geological epochs of stumbling, you spot a trough outside a weather-beaten saloon. The prospector from earlier, now even more disheveled, his beard woven with twigs and despair, beckons you over. "Water!" he announces like it's a cure for everything, when we all know it's the West's sneakiest facilitator of dysentery. You clench your teeth, knowing full well that this trough is a microbial stew of every creature's demise for miles. But thirst is persuasive. You lean in, nostrils flaring at the bouquet of algae and cow droppings, and lap like a kitten in the desert of your dreams. The cool liquid trickles down your throat, and immediately invites a whole carnival of bacteria to set up camp in your gut. Lesson 3. Hydration isn't always a blessing. You spend the next 6 hours alternating between agony and gut-wrenching wails that resemble a mule with a bar fight hangover. Meanwhile, the town doctor, a man whose idea of medical hygiene is switching from one hand towel to the other, grins behind a curtained window. He charges you a fistful of gold dust to apply leeches to your belly, while lecturing you on the moral decay of modern vices like drinking questionable water or wearing mismatched socks, which apparently signals a lack of virtue. Scene 2. Frontier justice, courtroom karaoke. Nursing your festering bowels, you meander toward the makeshift courthouse, a cabin held together by gossip and superglue. Inside, the judge, a squinty-eyed fellow who once got dragged behind a horse for tax evasion, bangs a plank of wood as a gavel. He peers at you over thick spectacles and asks, "State your business." You stammer something about being robbed, then waterboarded by hydration, and his expression shifts to one of mild amusement. In this town, justice is a spectator sport. The banker from the coach is there, dressed in his Sunday best despite being robbed of his Sunday shirt. He offers a solemn affidavit that you and the prospector were victims of nefarious villainy. The prospector, still twitching from leech therapy, adds a flourish by fainting dramatically, which the audience mistakes for theatrical flair and applauds. The judge rubs his chin. "Well," he pronounces, "ain't no law against being mugged, then mugged by illness, then mugged by leeches. Case dismissed. Court's adjourned for poker and whiskey." The courtroom disperses, and you're left wondering if you accidentally wandered into a circus where you're both the clown and the sideshow attraction. Lesson 4. Laws in the West are as mobile. As the cattle drive, you realize that justice in the frontier isn't blind. It's more like wearing one contact lens. Unless you can pay the town dentist to carve a more sympathetic eyebrow, the law is a lopsided seesaw, ripe for tilting with coin or coercion. Your only hope is to find a real marshal in the next town. But that's another 5 miles down a road that hasn't been graded since the French Revolution. Scene 3. The Pursuit, an ode to slow motion. Dragging your wounded carcass back onto the trail, you're determined to put as much distance between yourself and the coach of doom. But the West has its own version of, you can run, but you can't hide. Every crunch of gravel behind you sets your heart racing, even if it's just a tumbleweed staging a surprise ambush. Halfway up Coyote Ridge, you hear hoofbeats in the distance. Your pulse leaps to your throat. Are the bandits coming back for souvenirs? You scramble behind a boulder, only to find it's a lone ranger on a horseback, hat tipped low. Relief floods you, until you notice he's dragging a string of waxed mustaches behind him, like trophies from a neighborly prank war. He rears his horse and squints down at you. "Lost, stranger?" he asks. Your mind races. Is he a good guy or a decoy for more misery? You stutter. I seem to have misplaced my life savings and possibly my future. The ranger chuckles, then dismounts and offers water from a canteen that could double as a boot polish container. You gulp it gratefully, ignoring the rancid aftertaste. He introduces himself as Deputy Abel Straight Arrow Shaw, the only lawman for 50 miles. He's heading toward Calico Junction to pick up supplies, but says he can escort you if you cover his whiskey tab. You trade your soul for a shot of bourbon, so you nod vigorously. Lesson 5. Help comes with a price. In the Old West, kindness is like finding a pearl in a rattlesnake nest, rare and potentially lethal. Deputy Shaw's escort is less a chivalrous gesture and more a business transaction. He's not in it for your safety, he's in it for the chance to hold up the general store again once you leave. But beggars can't be choosers, and right now, you're begging for cholesterol to sustain you through calamity. Scene 4. Midnight cries and campfire lies. Night falls with no polite invitation. You camp under a sky so vast it reminds you how magnificently tiny your problems are, until a coyote chorus reminds you of how magnificently terrified you should be. Shaw starts a fire that glows like the embers of your trust in humanity. Over stale jerky, he shares tales of previous clients who were chewed up by desert scorpions, gunned down in bar brawls, or convinced they could outsmart nature. Spoiler, they couldn't. You chime in with your stagecoach debacle, expecting solidarity. Instead, he snorts. You think that's bad? Last week I found a fella who'd been robbed twice, first by bandits, then by his own mule. That mule made off with his pants. You force a laugh, but your core registers it as a cry for help. In the flickering firelight, you imagine the fan humming in your modern living room. The gentle hum a lullaby compared to the tumbleweeds scratching against your tent. For a moment, you consider burning the tent, trading it for a Hail Mary barrel ride off a cliff. Anything to end this relentless parade of misery. Lesson 6. The desert is as merciless as a bad Yelp review. The West doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care if you're rich, clever, or a halfway decent line dancer. It will flay you through heat stroke, dehydrate you via scenic water troughs, and then laugh as you sell off body parts for trinkets. You're not battling nature. You're enduring her disdain. Scene 5. Dawn's false promise. At first light, Shaw hollers, "Pack it up, partner." He spurs his horse and you scramble to stow your gear, most of which is now outlaw property or biological hazard. As you mount up, you notice your reflection in a droplet on a leaf. Hollow eyes, dust-choked eyebrows, and lips cracked like a crevasse in a glacier of regret. Yet you're alive. For now, you exchange coin for horse feed, pat your steed with gratitude that's as awkward as wearing someone else's breeches. The road ahead leads to Calico Junction, where your journey began. But you're no longer the naive passenger yearning for frontier thrills. You're a battered veteran of Brigand Theater, an unintentional star of the great Stagecoach show. And the encore is just around the bend, Frontier Justice, The Reckoning, coming up in Part 3, the grand return to Calico Junction, where your creditors line up like buzzards. Doctoring your wounds with questionable remedies, spoiler, maggots might show up. Confronting the banker and discovering your promissory note invention wasn't as creative as you thought, and the harrowing twist that could seal your fate, or at least your coffin. Stay tuned, hit that like button if you're still alive, and let me know in the comments which part of this Western nightmare has you reaching for a modern-day Uber instead. Part 3. The Reckoning, a return to civilization's charade. You creak back into Calico Junction at the exact moment the sun decides to roast your soul like a Sunday sermon, squinting through heat waves that dance across the dusty main street. You've transformed from naive traveler into a limping relic of frontier torment. 3 ribs fractured, 1 ego pulverized, and a bladder so depleted it could squeak if you squeezed it. The town's smoky silhouette greets you like an ex-loathing ex-lover, familiar, comfortable, and yet capable of inflicting fresh misery at any moment. The same saloon where you guzzled that lethal water dip now brags a fresh coat of paint, mostly slathered over bullet holes. The sheriff stands outside, polishing his badge with the reverence of a priest polishing a relic. He tips his hat and asks if you've come to press charges. You glance at your wallet, empty, and realize pressing anything costs money, even your luck. Scene 1. Facing the banker, collateral damage. Your first order of business, confronting Mr. Dashiell Polished Pennington, The banker who once feigned sympathy while tallying your stolen gold dollar with the delight of a lottery announcer. He sits behind a grand desk that's more polished than his conscience, counting paper IOUs as though they're legal tender. You storm in, well, more like hobble in, with the grace of a turtle lugging an anvil, demanding recompense. His perfectly waxed mustache twitches. "Ah, Mr. Unfortunate, I trust your return to civilization finds you invigorated?" His voice drips like a melting candle over a hot tar. You slam your fist, carefully due to those ribs, on the desk. "You owe me for this." You brandish a blood-stained handkerchief as evidence of your suffering. He peers at it through a monocle. "I'm afraid our agreement never covered emotional trauma or accidental rib fracturing." He leans back, tapping a polished boot against your bootless dignity. "However, I'm willing to offer you a loan, secured by that lovely stagecoach hat you're wearing." You realize two things simultaneously. One, you no longer have your hat. It's now a dashing accessory on the boss outlaw's noggin. And two, any loan from this gentleman will cost more than all the gold in New Mexico. Lesson 7. The bank's motto, "In debt we trust." If you expect empathy from a frontier banker, you'll find about as much as in a cactus flower. Beautiful in theory, lethal in practice. The only way out is through a quagmire of red tape and interest rates that could give a vulture vertigo. You shuffle out, courtesy of a debt note for future consideration, which probably means they'll cash in when you have nothing left but a single boot. Scene 2. Medical mayhem, home remedies, and ragged hope. Next stop, Doc Roderick Quachillin McGraw's clinic, which looks suspiciously like a repurposed chicken coop. He greets you with a toothless smile and a syringe filled with something that smells of spent kerosene. "Here to patch you up, partner?" he says, donning a pair of spectacles so cracked they could slice bread. He jabs the syringe into your shoulder and mutters, "This here's whiskey tinctured with gunpowder, numbs the pain and doubles as a disinfectant." You wince, considering that the only thing more painful than your cuts is trusting a doctor whose medical degree probably came from a Cracker Jack box. He wraps your ribs in linen so tight you can barely breathe, but he promises this will help with proper ventilation. In the back, you spot a jar labeled maggots for cleaning wounds. You ask if they come pre-packaged with a bid farewell to dignity guarantee, and he chuckles. "Don't worry, they do the crawling, so you don't have to." Lesson 8. Frontier medicine, where fear is the only sterilizer. In the Old West, you don't so much heal as negotiate with infection. Maggots feast on dead tissue while living on your tax dollars. Whiskey acts as both cure and cause of every other ailment. You leave the clinic feeling medically preserved, like a taxidermied raccoon. Scene 3. Gathering allies. Desperation's last resort. You realize that if you're going to wrest justice, or at least a slice of restitution, you'll need backup. So you swing by the saloon and slide onto a stool that's stickier than a trapdoor promise. The bartender, Slim 2 Left O'Reilly, slides you a glass of questionable amber liquid. Behind you, the prospector from your stagecoach, now rebranded as Dusty Dan, grins, waving a gold pan. "Found another vein, friend. Got enough dust to pay off Mr. Pennington twice over." He swirls the pan, letting glints of fool's gold shimmer like false hope. You eye the pan. "Is that real gold or the West's version of confetti?" He winks. Takes 3 tests, the tooth test, the acid test, and the banker's test, where they confirm it's not scrap metal glued together. You hire Dan on the spot, figuring that even if his vein dries up, his optimism will outshine any gold bullion. Then you recruit Maribel Maria Mayhem, Mendoza's lookout cousin, Rusty One-Eye Delgado, who owes you a favor after you saved him from a particularly venomous rattlesnake, or so he claims. Lesson 9. Allies in the West, as stable as a mule on ice. Your makeshift posse resembles the rejected cast of a traveling medicine show. A prospector with imaginary riches, a one-eyed lookout with questionable eyesight, and a guy who once wheezed violently while saving someone from snake venom. But they're all you've got. With resolve bolstered by near-certain ruin, you prepare for the final showdown, reclaiming your dignity, gold, and hat, preferably in that order. Scene 4. The heist of the heist, turning tables on the outlaws. Under the cover of moonlight, you and Rusty sneak along the trail to the outlaw camp, a wretched collection of battered tents and stolen dreams. The boss outlaw's mustache gleams in the lantern glow. You whisper your plan. Dusty Dan will distract them with tall tales of richer veins just over yonder. Meanwhile, you and Rusty will slip into the tent where your belongings lie, protected by a single sleeping guard who snores like a steam engine. Dan unleashes a torrent of gibberish about gold so pure it can blind a man. The outlaws, naturally, shift their attention, salivating at the prospect of fresh plunder. You and Rusty slip inside, heartbeats hammering like runaway stagecoach wheels. You find your hat perched atop a crate, hatband still buttoned with pride. Beside it lies your wallet, now a sad shell of its former self, but containing the IOUs you need to pay the dock and bankers. You stuff everything into your coat and slip back out, only to hear a grunt. The sleeping guard's snores have ceased. His one good eye snaps open, bugging out like a startled toad. You freeze, then remember you're only carrying an empty jerky wrapper in your hand. With the sophistication of a Broadway ninja, you lob it across the tent. The guard's eye follows the fluttering wrapper, instant diversion, and you and Rusty flee into the night. Lesson 10. Retribution's sweet sandalwood scent. Justice in the West isn't served by a judge, it's carved by your own cunning and the occasional thrown snack. You escape back to town, mana of conquest in your pockets. Your hat, your wallet, and a handful of Outlaw the Mustache wax as a souvenir. Scene 5. Epilogue. A hollow victory. You return to Calico Junction at dawn, looking every bit the rugged anti-hero in a cheap novel. The banker's jaw drops when you swagger in, hat reclaimed like an exclamation mark. He sputters as you slam the IOUs on his counter. I believe these settle our arrangement. He glances from your ribs, now taped like a broken fence, to the outlaw wax. Sheriff straightens. Doc McGraw nods sagely, as though he's seen this kind of miracle weekly. The townsfolk gather, cheering. You assume it's for you, but the prospectors juggling fool's gold in the background may have something to do with it. You tip your hat, slowly to avoid dislocating a shoulder, and declare, remember folks, always count your rifles, your coins, and your ribs before boarding a stagecoach. The West is a cruel mistress with a smiling face, but she remembers every debt. The crowd erupts. You realize they're more entertained by your misery than you ever were by your own hopes. But as you bask in reluctant glory, you know your journey's end is still a mirage. There's one more chapter left in your Western saga, coming up in part 4, a final showdown with frontier superstition and possibly a demon goat. The bittersweet taste of freedom after paying off every scoundrel in a 50-mile radius, a panic sprint toward modernity, if you can just hitch a ride on a railroad car without getting run over, and the true cost of surviving the Old West, beyond skin, bones, and broken dreams. Buckle up, friends. This grand finale will be a ride wilder than a 6-shooter salute at high noon. Part 4, the grand finale. Death, debts, and deserted railways. Day 4 in Calico Junction begins like every other dawn in the Old West, with the bone-dry taste of regret in your mouth, dust in places dust should never be, and a lingering suspicion that if God exists, he left for California years ago. You wake up in the saloon's upstairs room you didn't pay for, alongside a mattress that smells like wet burlap and decisions you wish you could unmake. Your ribs still feel like they're hosting a family reunion of angry woodpeckers, and your face, judging by the cracked mirror, is now a roadmap of bruises, sunburn, and the kind of vacant trauma one usually reserves for people who lose at Russian roulette twice. But there's no time to mourn what's left of your soul, because rumor has it there's a train rolling through town at high noon, and you, dear friend, are done with this place. Scene 1. Superstitions and demonic goats. Before you can crawl to the railway platform, an elderly woman blocks your path. Her hair is a tangle of white straw, her face a parchment of wrinkles, and her eyes a pair of milky marbles that have seen more death than frontier justice. She grips your arm with the strength of a bear trap. You can't leave today, she whispers, her breath a mixture of sage and something vaguely rodent adjacent. The signs ain't right. The devil's got his goat out roaming, and he only takes men who try to outrun their fates. You blink. I just want to catch a train, she cackles. The goat won't care, son. He knows sinners by smell. And wouldn't you know it, 10 feet away stands a black billy goat, one mangled ear and one amber eye gleaming like a coin fresh from hell. The townsfolk part around it like it's a loaded cannon. It stares at you, chews a lump of something indiscernible, and lets out a bleat so low it sounds like an empty grave coughing. Lesson 11. In the West, even the livestock wants you dead. You sidestep the goat, mumbling assurances to yourself that demonic livestock isn't a real thing. It follows for a few feet, bleeding the unholy soundtrack of your anxiety, before losing interest in gnawing on a discarded boot. You mark it down as one more reason this town deserves to burn. Scene 2. Settling debts in the filthiest saloon on earth. But before you can bolt for the tracks, Slim O'Reilly the bartender corners you with a grin like a snake oil salesman on commission. "Say, stranger," he croons, "you still owe for them 4 whiskeys you didn't technically order, but definitely consumed." You reach into your pocket and pull out the outlawed mustache wax, slamming it on the counter like a poker chip. "Trade." Slim's eyes gleam. "The good stuff, huh? Alright, debt settled." You've just paid for liquor with a hardened clump of mustache grease, proving once again that currency in the Old West is about as abstract as modern cryptocurrency, and equally shady. Scene 3. The train station of disappointment. The station is little more than a splintered platform with a rusted bell, manned by a telegraph operator who looks like he's been embalmed with tobacco juice. He informs you the train is delayed because a bridge collapsed under a cow herd 2 towns over, and the surviving cows staged a small but effective rebellion. You consider hitching a ride on a passing wagon, but the only one heading out belongs to a traveling preacher and his 7 children. You know your luck too well. If you climb aboard, you'll either get struck by lightning or wind up married to the eldest daughter before sundown. Lesson 12. Escape isn't an option, it's a theoretical concept. At this point, your remaining options are: wait for a train that might arrive sometime before the sun burns out, join the cattle rebellion, accept your fate and open a blacksmith shop. None of them inspire confidence. Scene 4. The final showdown. Right when you think you've hit rock bottom, a familiar voice hisses your name. Turning, you see the outlaw boss, mustache freshly twirled, a smug grin pasted across his sun-leathered face. He's back, this time alone and holding a battered sack. "Left something behind," he says, tossing it at your feet. You peer inside. Your original gold dollar, your pocket knife, and, saints preserve us, your second sock. He tips his hat. "Fair's fair. Found him lying in a ditch. Ain't no sport in robbing a man twice." You gape. "You nearly killed me," he shrugs. "And yet here you are. Hell of a thing surviving." Then, without fanfare, he turns, mounts a stolen horse, and vanishes into the haze. You look down at the sack in your hands, a pathetic bounty for the nightmare you endured. But the town's gathering again, murmuring admiration. Not because you got your stuff back, but because you lived long enough to get robbed a second time. Lesson 13. The West is a glorious scam, and you just bought in. There's a warped kind of fame in surviving out here. You realize the townsfolk will be telling your story long after you've left, or died in a cactus ditch somewhere. The stagecoach ghost, the man who took on bandits and dysentery and lived. You'd almost be flattered if your spleen wasn't bruised. Scene 5. The real price of survival. That evening, you sit at the edge of town, sack in lap, watching the sun paint the sky blood orange. You're left with the bitter aftertaste of survival. Not because you beat the odds, but because the odds were rigged, and they forgot to finish you off. Your final tally: 3 broken ribs, 4 debts paid in dubious currency, a possible demonic goat curse, newfound local fame you neither wanted nor earned, and a wallet lighter than a miner's promises. And yet, you've made it. You spit into the dust and vow, if that train ever arrives, you'll board it if it's hauling dynamite and cobras. Lesson 14. Death comes easy. Living is work in the Old West. Survival isn't about guts or guns. It's about grim stubbornness, an ability to outweigh misery, and a sense of humor so dark it could black out a noonday sun. Final words. So, to all those dime novel daydreamers out there, no, you wouldn't survive a stagecoach robbery, not even close. You'd be coughing up dirt, wrangling demonic livestock, getting stiffed by bankers, and haggling for your own socks. You'd die of a splinter infection, a bad bet, or sheer narrative irony. But if, by some cosmic joke, you did make it, congratulations. You'd be a living, limping reminder that the West was less about manifest destiny and more about manifest agony. And the true reward? A cracked tooth grin, a dented hat, and stories so outlandish nobody back east would believe a word. Thanks for writing this one out, partners. If you enjoyed watching a stranger's body get repeatedly betrayed by fate and frontier hospitality, drop a comment and tell me which moment had you rethinking your Old West fantasies. And if you still dream of living back then, may the demonic goat find you first. End of line. Quick question. Have you ever thought, you know what sounds like a good idea? Staring down a half-drunk lunatic with a 6-shooter in one hand and a death wish in the other, while the entire town places bets on which of us will soil our trousers first? No? Well, congratulations. You possess survival instincts superior to 90% of Old West inhabitants. But for those of you still romanticizing those dusty, bullet-riddled days, let's take a little walk together into one of history's most overrated forms of assisted suicide, the classic high noon duel. Part 1. How to ruin your life in under 30 seconds. Let's start by explaining how a duel, something that sounds like an elegant, honorable test of skill in the movies, was in real life about as classy as 2 starving coyotes fighting over a chicken carcass behind a saloon outhouse. The recipe for a duel in theory, all you needed was 2 morons with a beef, a public square, some poorly maintained pistols, an audience of unemployed gamblers, the sun directly overhead to ensure everyone died hot and miserable. In practice, it usually began with someone getting a little too mouthy over a poker game, an insult about someone's mother, or a perceived slight as minor as looking sideways at a man's horse. The West, you see, was not a place for calm negotiation. It was a place where disagreements were resolved by lead projectiles traveling at bone-shattering speeds. The accused would toss out the challenge, or in some cases just announce, "High noon tomorrow outside the livery stable," like some whiskey-drenched wedding invitation. And heaven help you if you were the one being challenged, because etiquette demanded you either show up to fight or leave town forever in shame, chased out by cackling children and old ladies waving chamber pots. Why, you'd already be dead. Let's be clear, the average citizen of the Old West didn't have formal firearms training. Most people who carried guns knew just enough to accidentally shoot their own foot or blow out their eardrum trying to clean it. And dueling pistols weren't the precision-engineered masterpieces you see in movies. They were cranky little death sticks that jammed, misfired, or blew up in your hand if you glared at them wrong. Not only would your gun probably fail, but so would your courage. Because when the clock struck noon and you stepped out into that blistering sun, your body would betray you in every conceivable way. Sweaty palms, dry throat, legs shaking like a tumbleweed in a tornado, and a sinking realization that you've essentially volunteered to stand motionless while a pissed-off lunatic takes aim at your vital organs. The ritual of doom. It wasn't just about the shootout. There was a whole gruesome routine to it. The stare down. A prolonged, awkward silence while both duelists tried to look mean and unafraid, though one was usually seconds from weeping. The town folk gathering. Everyone in town would stop what they were doing. Blacksmiths would down tools, school teachers would shoo kids indoors, and the preacher would hang around hoping to drum up last-minute confessions. The count-off. Sometimes there'd be a formal referee, like a sheriff or the town drunk, to count paces and shout, "Draw." But often, it was just 2 men glaring until one of them twitched. Pro. Tip, don't flinch. The unspoken rule was simple. He who drew first had to hit. If you drew first and missed, you'd better start praying faster than bullets travel, because your opponent now had a clear, justifiable excuse to ventilate you. Unfortunately, in the Old West, prayer was not known for its bullet-stopping abilities. What happens when you actually get hit? Now, let's dispel another myth. Nobody ever died quickly and cleanly in these duels. Bullets were slow, heavy, and fired from unreliable black powder revolvers. If you were lucky, you might catch a slug in the shoulder and only spend the next 6 months dying of infection in a dimly lit, rat-infested back room while the town doctor waved leeches over you. More likely, you'd get gut shot, which meant hours, sometimes days, of screaming agony, while your insides did their best impression of boiled pudding. The townsfolk would clear the street, muttering about how you died brave, even though half of them bet money you'd soil yourself before noon. Lesson 1. Never take life advice from a gambler. If you happen to survive your duel by some cosmic mistake, maybe your opponent tripped on a cat or his gun exploded in his own face, it happened more often than you'd think. You weren't in the clear. You were now a marked man, because in the Wild West, killing someone, even legally, made you a target for his vengeful brothers, his best friend, who swore on whiskey and grave dirt to avenge him, a traveling bounty hunter who'd never heard of you, But like the idea of practice, survival wasn't about skill. It was about keeping moving, staying paranoid, and never trusting anyone with clean fingernails or a too friendly grin. Your gear would betray you. It's also worth noting your attire during this inevitable death sentence would be actively working against you. Heavy wool coats, leather boots so stiff they could double as coffins, a hat meant to deflect sun but more likely to blow off dramatically in the wind. Everything about the Old West was designed to make your final moments uncomfortable. By the time you took your place in the dirt street, you'd be sweating like a roast pig, half blinded by sun glare, and praying the guy across from you forgot which end of the gun does the shooting. The audience was the real winner. Let's not forget the real beneficiaries of any duel, the bored townsfolk. The Old West was duller than a butter knife. There was no TV, no internet, and the only reliable entertainment was watching other people make terrible decisions. A duel meant excitement, bets would fly, kids would climb onto rooftops for a better view. Old ladies would bake pies to celebrate whichever man got blown to bits. The saloon would run a special on cheap whiskey, and the preacher would conveniently appear with a portable coffin supplier. For them, your impending demise was the highlight of the month, maybe the year, which meant the pressure to make your death as dramatic as possible was immense. Lesson 2. Heroic last words are hard to pull off. Everyone dreamed of going out with a line like, "Tell my ma I died clean," or "I'll see you in hell, friend." But in reality, the most common final words before a duel were, "Wait, can we talk about this?" "Oh no." If you were truly unlucky, your final words would be a squeak of terror or an impressively audible bowel movement. The reality of Old West. Gunslinging. Here's a fun fact most people missed. Dueling at high noon wasn't some precision sport. The average distance was 20 to 30 feet, which feels close until you factor in the shaky hands, unreliable weapons, sun blindness, and adrenaline-fueled tunnel vision. Some duels resulted in both men missing every shot before either tackling each other or mutually agreeing to go get drunk instead, which in retrospect was probably the only smart decision anyone in town ever made. The psychological horror show. Even if you managed to avoid getting shot, or if both of you missed entirely, the stress alone could shave years off your life. Nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if the other guy would sneak into your room with a hatchet. Paranoia every time someone new strolled into town wearing a long coat, jumping at shadows and loud door hinges. Because surviving one duel in the West didn't mean you were safe. It meant you'd probably have to fight another one, and another, until your luck ran out, and trust me, it always did. To be continued. Coming up in part 2, how bar fights, livestock disputes, and extremely bad poker hands turned into duels. A deep dive into the truly absurd superstitions surrounding gunfighting luck charms, and why your chances of surviving the aftermath were even worse than surviving the bullet itself. Stick around, partners, it only gets worse from here. Part 2, the art of dying stupidly, what actually gets you into a duel. Let's clear something up right now. Nobody woke up in the Old West thinking, you know what'd spice up this Tuesday? Bleeding out in a dusty street while a one-eyed blacksmith places bets on how long I'll twitch. No, most duels didn't happen because of carefully weighed decisions or noble causes. They happened because Old West life was a tangle of boredom, alcohol, toxic masculinity, and a staggering shortage of adult supervision. How you'd actually get roasted. You didn't need to murder a man's brother, seduce his wife, or steal his cattle to earn yourself a duel. All it took was one of the following offenses: winning a poker hand too confidently, looking at someone's horse longer than 3 seconds, stepping on another man's spittoon puddle, sneezing during a sermon, spilling whiskey on someone's boot. Yes, in a world where human life was treated with the same casual indifference as a broken fence post, it really was that easy. Bar fights that turn into formal murders. The standard career path to a high noon showdown often started in a saloon. Picture it. You, sweating through a threadbare shirt, sitting in a room that smells like sour sweat and horses. A card game's going badly. You accuse a man of cheating, because let's be honest, he is. And instead of everyone calming down and ordering a round of drinks, the room falls silent. Someone mutters, "You gonna let him say that to your face, Hank?" Now Hank is drunk, Hank is angry, and Hank is constitutionally incapable of walking away. So Hank does what Hank has done 12 times before. he challenges you to a duel. Important historical fact: most duels were avoidable. Historians estimate that nearly 80% of Old West gunfights could have been prevented if one or both parties had taken a nap, eaten a sandwich, or briefly contemplated the fragility of human existence. But in a culture where backing down meant you might as well crawl into a hole and let the vultures finish you off, everyone had to pretend they were fine with dying over a spilled drink, superstitions, and dumb luck charms. Since no one in these scenarios could actually shoot worth a damn, they relied heavily on good luck charms. Some classics included a rabbit's foot, a lock of hair from a red-headed lady, a bullet they dug out of a friend's corpse, a piece of wood from a hanging tree, a clump of dirt from their mother's grave. If this sounds grim, congratulations, you're catching on. The West was a nightmarish theme park built entirely on gallows humor. The problem, of course, is that none of these charms did a thing, but men swore by them anyway, clutching them during showdowns like talismans, believing that the universe cared one whit about their half-loaded Colt and rapidly eroding nerve. The sheriff's role: an exercise in futility. People often imagine the town sheriff as a stern figure of law and order, ready to step in and halt needless bloodshed. Reality check: the average frontier sheriff was one of three things: too drunk to care, too broke to intervene, placing his own bet on who would die first. Sheriffs knew better than to get in the way of duels. Interfering meant alienating half the town's population, getting punched in the throat, or worse, having to write a report. So they'd stand back, chew tobacco, and hope the victor didn't decide to celebrate by robbing the general store. The actual weapons: the saddest six-shooters. Hollywood loves to show perfectly balanced, lovingly polished revolvers capable of splitting a hair at 20 paces. The truth? Guns in the 1870s were sloppy, heavy, and about as reliable as like a paper umbrella in a hailstorm. A typical dueling pistol might misfire, backfire, discharge its round an inch to the left, disassemble itself mid-shot. A surprising number of duelists died not because their opponent was a good shot, but because their own gun exploded in their hand, and if you didn't have your own weapon, you were handed one by a bystander, often in worse shape than the teeth of the guy lending it. Lesson 3. Don't trust anyone's equipment. There was no quality control. Ammunition was hand-poured, barrels were warped, and triggers stuck like molasses in January. Guns might have one good shot in them, and that was being generous. The psychological death march. Once challenged, there was no polite declining. Refusing meant you were a coward, and being labeled a coward in a frontier town was a fate worse than death. It meant no one would drink with you, no one would buy your cattle, and no one would sleep with you, not even the toothless lady who sold suspicious pies by the roadside, so you'd accept because you had to. And then came the worst part: waiting. You'd spend the hours leading up to the duel trapped inside your own skull, imagining every scenario: how you'd get shot, how you'd miss, how your mother would find out you died like a fool in a saloon dispute over a spilled poker chip. Some men tried to drink through it, others prayed, a few practiced shooting, usually into fence posts or, tragically, their own toes. Lesson 4. Fear is a universal equalizer. It didn't matter if you were a gambler, a rancher, or a bounty hunter. Standing alone in a dusty street with death on the clock made everyone's stomach drop to their boots. Fear, in this case, wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the only rational response to an otherwise completely irrational system, the spectacle of idiocy. By the time high noon rolled around, the whole town would turn out. Women would watch from shaded porches, children would peek through fence slats, dogs would curl up on sidewalks unconcerned, the preacher would mutter last rites out of habit, and then you and your opponent would step into the sun, sweating rivers under stiff coats, squinting through heat ripples, both pretending not to be terrified. And somewhere, someone would shout, "Draw." Why no one actually won in duels? It was rare for both men to walk away, but it was also rare for either man to come out a winner. Sure, one might shoot the other in the chest, the victor might survive, but he'd also be marked. Other men, friends of the deceased, aspiring tough guys, or bored cowboys with nothing better to do, would look to challenge the winner next, hoping to build their own name. Thus, surviving a duel made you public property, a walking target, a legend people wanted to test, dethrone, or stick full of holes. The aftermath, medical horror shows, If you took a bullet, God help you. The town doctor, if there was one, was usually a barber, dentist, and amateur veterinarian in his spare time. Anesthesia consisted of a stick to bite and a glass of rye whiskey. Tools were unsterilized, treatments experimental, and survival rates comparable to playing Russian roulette with a fully loaded gun. Worst case scenario, you died of gangrene. Second worst, you lived, but minus a limb or organ you probably needed. Lesson 5. The real battle was avoiding the doctor. If you couldn't avoid the bullet, your next best hope was to die outright. Anything else meant a slow, gruesome decline involving fever dreams, agonizing infections, and the persistent belief that a demonic goat was lurking outside your window. To be continued. Coming up in part 3, how bounty hunters, drifters, and trigger-happy marshals made the Old West a death trap even without formal duels, the absurd black market economy around dueling gear, and why your chance of surviving even an uneventful afternoon in a frontier town was depressingly low. We're not even halfway to rock bottom yet, partners. Stay tuned. Part 3, Death by Bystander, why survival was basically illegal. By this point in our cheerful descent into historical madness, you might be thinking, okay, maybe I'd avoid a duel. Keep my head down, tip my hat, drink my whiskey quietly, and make it out of this godforsaken town alive. Cute idea. Very naive. Because even if you managed to dodge every formal high noon showdown, the Old West had about 100 other creative ways to convert you into a bullet sponge. Let's talk about the supporting cast of hell. Bounty hunters, the men who hunted you. For exercise, contrary to what the movies suggest, bounty hunters weren't charming rogues with a heart of gold. They were usually half-drunk, fully deranged, and morally bankrupt opportunists who saw human lives as walking banknotes. You didn't need to be a criminal to end up on one of their lists. A bar brawl, an unpaid debt, or an unlucky resemblance to a wanted poster could put a price on your head, and the only thing bounty hunters loved more than whiskey was shooting a man first and asking the corpse for ID later. They didn't care if you were innocent. They didn't care if it was a case of mistaken identity. If a bounty existed, they'd hunt you down like a prairie rat, string you up and collect their fee, assuming you hadn't already been claimed by dysentery or a misfired pistol. The drifters, ambulatory nightmares. Then you had the drifters, wandering men with no fixed address, no attachments, and no discernible purpose other than to show up in a town, drink, fight, and either die or leave a pile of bodies behind. You might recognize them as the precursor to modern disaster tourists. Drifters operated by a simple code. If a man looks at you wrong, kill him. If he doesn't, kill him anyway, just to be sure. The odds of crossing one were high. The odds of surviving the encounter were low. The marshal's reluctant trigger finger. Marshals in frontier towns weren't the unflinching paragons of justice you imagine. They were exhausted, cynical, underpaid relics who spent most of their time trying not to get shot and occasionally breaking up drunken fistfights with a shovel. If a duel broke out, the marshal's job wasn't to stop it. It was to make sure the winner left town before dark, because no one wanted the hassle of jail cells, trials, or paperwork. God forbid paperwork. Lesson 6. The law was not your friend. In the Old West, justice wasn't blind. It was just too hungover to care. The best you could hope for was that the marshal owed you a favor, or was too drunk to remember your face. Otherwise, you were on your own. The black market for death accessories. Believe it or not, dueling had its own economy. Traveling peddlers and con artists sold everything from lucky shooting charms, which were usually just dead frogs on a string, to guaranteed killer bullets, recycled lead balls someone pried from saloon walls. Need a pistol with a hair trigger? A smuggled knife for backup? A hip flask labeled for courage but filled with wood alcohol? Some guy behind the livery stable had you covered, for a price. Lesson 7. If it sounds too good to be true, it'll probably explode in your hand. Many a duelist met his end because he bought a cheap knockoff pistol that fired sideways, or ammunition packed by a drunken blacksmith. One man famously tried to cheat by sneaking a double-barrel Derringer into a duel. Both barrels misfired. He died of embarrassment shortly before bleeding out. The background killers, accidental death by spectator. And if the duel itself didn't kill you, the audience might. Every high noon shootout drew a crowd of opportunists hoping to witness history, or at least a gruesome spectacle to gossip about. problem was, those crowds were often armed, drunk, and terrible at personal boundaries. More than one duelist was accidentally shot by a spectator firing into the air to celebrate, or trampled by townsfolk fleeing a ricochet, or beaten senseless by a mob when he won a duel against a local favorite. In fact, statistically, your chances of being injured by a bystander were almost equal to being shot by your opponent. Lesson 8. Always assume everyone is armed and unstable. The Wild West didn't believe in gun control. Children carried derringers. Priests kept rifles under pews. Even bartenders had sawed-off shotguns mounted under the counter, which were legally considered decoration, the currency of reputation, a death sentence on credit. Here's the truly cursed part. Surviving a duel, or even being rumored to have won, made you valuable, not to yourself, but to every fool craving notoriety. If you shot a man at high noon, the next day, someone would challenge you, just to say they killed the man who killed Jedediah Quickdraw Collins. It created a pyramid scheme of violence where every death bred 3 new challengers, each with worse aim and lower hygiene. The town's role, an enabler of idiocy. Towns weren't neutral in these matters. They encouraged duels. They bet on them. Saloon owners made a killing, pun intended, selling drinks before and after. Undertakers made their fortune measuring coffins in advance. Some towns even had a duel street, a dedicated road where men could murder each other without disrupting traffic. Residents would lean out of windows, placing side wagers on which man would puke first from fear. The myth of glory. Old West legends would have you believe that surviving a duel turned you into a living legend. In reality, it made you a pariah. Other men either wanted to kill you, prove themselves, or rob you blind. Women might swoon at first, but after a week, you were just another scarred drifter too paranoid to sleep in the same place twice. Fame was a short-lived currency, exchanged quickly for anxiety, fresh bruises, and an early grave. The unwritten rule: you never really survived. Even if you survived your duel, patched up your bullet holes, paid off your debts, and rode out of town, the curse of the high noon duel followed you. Every new town had a gambler with a grudge. Every saloon had a bounty hunter looking for an easy mark. Every marshland had a drifter itching to carve his name into legend. You weren't a hero. You were a marked man on borrowed time. Lesson 9. The West never forgave, and it sure as hell didn't forget. The only true way to escape the cycle was to fake your death, change your name, and move far enough east that nobody wore spurs. Even then, your past might catch up. Some enterprising teenager or bitter widow would eventually track you down. Because death in the Old West wasn't an event. It was a profession, a sport, and a legacy. To be continued. Coming up in part 4, what happened to your remains if you didn't make it out alive? Spoiler, it wasn't dignified. How saloons cashed in on your corpse, and why your ghost probably stuck around just to laugh bitterly at future fools walking the same dusty streets. Strap in, folks. The finale's about to get darker than a snake oil salesman's conscience. Part 4, Death, Dignity, and the Posthumous Hustle. Alright, you've made it to the final chapter of this delightful descent into Old West despair. By now, you should have realized that survival in a high noon duel was never about who was faster or braver. It was about who was dumb enough to show up, unlucky enough to get hit, and stubborn enough to keep crawling afterwards. But what if you didn't crawl? What if that last bullet found your spleen, your skull, or some other inconveniently vital organ? Buckle up, because in the Old West, dying was only the start of your problems. What happens to your corpse? First things first, nobody was coming to gently cradle your head and weep over your broken form. The undertaker, who probably witnessed your demise while enjoying a cigar and betting against you, would shuffle out of his workshop with a measuring stick, size you up where you lay, and decide if you were worth a full-sized coffin or just a shallow hole under the mesquite tree. And let's not sugarcoat it. That coffin wasn't yours to keep. If you had no surviving family, and most didn't, your body might be buried in a borrowed box, only to be dumped out later so the lumber could be reused for someone else's final trip. Lesson 10. You didn't own your death. You see, death was just another transaction in frontier towns. You weren't a fallen hero. You were unpaid labor for the local economy. Your remains might be displayed in the saloon for a few days to attract drinkers, stolen by medical students for educational purposes, mutilated by the town drunk who believed dead men made good luck charms, or worse, your scalp could end up tacked to the wall of the sheriff's office with a little hand-painted sign reading, Billy Stuttershot McGraw, 4 kills, 1 cat, the deathbed auction. Before you were cold, your possessions would be up for grabs. That gun you loved, claimed by a deputy. Your boots, sold for a bottle of rye. That half-eaten biscuit in your pocket, eaten by the town dog. Your name would be traded in stories, most of them inaccurate, like, he took 6 bullets and didn't flinch. He challenged death itself to a draw. He tripped over a horse and accidentally shot the preacher. The truth never stood a chance. The saloon special. Many frontier saloons ran a tradition known as the dead man's drink. When someone bit the dust in a duel, the saloon keeper would name a cocktail after them, usually a lethal mix of cheap whiskey, kerosene, and whatever clear liquid was leaking from the walls. The town would gather to toast your short, terrible life, then immediately start debating who'd be next. It was the closest thing to a eulogy you were going to get. Lesson 11. Immortality was measured in bar tabs. If you were particularly unlucky, or infamous, your death site would become a makeshift tourist trap, a bloodstain on the dirt road. Folks would claim it never faded. The stump you bled out against, some entrepreneur would sell slivers of it as souvenirs. They might even claim your ghost still roamed the saloon at night, muttering about your stolen boots. The ghost problem. Because nothing says Old West like a bitter, vengeful ghost story. Towns invented them like rabbit's bread. You were expected to haunt the streets, rattle a window, or tip over a bottle if the mood struck. Legend had it that particularly angry duel victims could blow out lamps with an unseen breath, turn milk sour, whisper curses in gamblers' ears. In some cases, townsfolk would hang a new horseshoe or sprinkle salt on your grave, just in case you decided to stage a supernatural encore. The next day's duel. And here's the final insult. Before your body cooled, someone else would be stepping up to the dueling line, because the frontier appetite for carnage didn't pause for funerals. Your death wasn't a tragedy, it was a scheduling opportunity, a new grudge, a new drunk idiot, a fresh bet placed, and the cycle rolled on. Lesson 12. Nobody mourned long in the West. Grief was a luxury. Most men in the Old West lost so many friends, brothers, and acquaintances that death barely registered as an inconvenience. At best, you were remembered for a week, usually because you owed someone money. At worst, you were just another mark on the saloon wall tally, another bullet casing in the dust, another tale swapped over whiskey and wood smoke. Your afterlife was a punchline. And yes, even in death, you weren't safe from mockery. The preacher might offer you a half-hearted blessing. The undertaker might carve your epitaph. He came, he shot, he bled. Kids would dare each other to spit on your grave. Old-timers would claim they knew you'd never amount to much, and your nemesis, assuming he survived, would brag about how you squealed like a pig before you dropped. Lesson 13. Death had terrible PR. In a world built on tall tales and whiskey-induced memory gaps, no one ever died with dignity. Even legends had their ghosts muddied by gossip. You know Wild Bill? Died picking his nose at the card table. Doc Holliday? Probably caught TB from a prostitute's poodle. Dead-Eye Dan? Tripped on his own spurs, which means no matter how you met your end, within days it would be reduced to a joke. A cautionary tale told to scare greenhorns. The truth about legends. That's the cruelest joke of all. The Old West didn't preserve heroes, it devoured them. Famous or forgotten, every man who stepped into that sun-baked street was ultimately reduced to dust, rumor, and barroom folklore. The lesson? You don't win a duel. You only survive long enough to die another day, with a slightly better nickname. Final lesson, stay indoors, partner. If time machines ever become a thing, do yourself a favor. Skip the high noon dueling era entirely. Unless your dream is to die penniless, boots stolen, immortalized in a drink that tastes like varnish, and blamed for ghostly mischief for the next 40 years. End of the road, and there it is. The cold, dusty, blood-soaked truth of why you wouldn't survive a duel at high noon. Because it wasn't about skill, or honor, or even luck. It was about stepping into a meat grinder of desperation, superstition, and alcohol-soaked bravado, where the only guaranteed winner was the Undertaker. Thanks for surviving this one with me. If you made it this far without flinching, you deserve a drink, preferably one without kerosene in it. And remember, if anyone ever says they missed the good old days, ask them if they'd like to die in a dirt street while the town drunk takes bets on how quickly their ghost will start rattling window shutters. Catch you on the next historical nightmare, partners. Quick question. Have you ever sat in traffic, looked around and thought, wow, this is hell, but at least I'm not chained to a wooden bench rowing a 400-ton floating death machine while a Roman psychopath shouts Latin insults at me? No? Well, buckle up, because today we're going to find out exactly what it would be like if you woke up on a Roman slave galley. Spoiler alert, it makes your morning commute look like a spa day. Part 1, Waking Up in a Historical Nightmare. Alright, picture this. You open your eyes to absolute darkness. The air is thick, damp, and smells like a combination of sweat, stale seawater, and hopelessness. You're sitting on a hard wooden bench, your wrists chained to an oar, and there's a half-naked man coughing blood beside you. Congratulations, you've just woken up on a Roman slave galley. Orientation, hell's floating office cubicle. Let's talk about the layout of this aquatic nightmare. The galley is essentially a long, narrow warship crammed full of rowers. It's 3 to 5 levels deep in some cases, depending on the size of the vessel, but let's not pretend any of them are good options. You're packed shoulder to shoulder with 100 other miserable souls, all chained to long, heavy wooden oars. Above you, a handful of sailors actually get to breathe fresh air, while the rest of you marinate in a stew of sweat, piss, and despair. The ceiling's low enough that even the shortest among you have to hunch, and the light comes from tiny gaps between planks, or if you're lucky, an oil lamp attached to a nail somewhere. In the background, you hear the relentless slap of water against the hull, and the occasional shriek from a whip meeting flesh. Welcome aboard. Who are you and why are you here? In case you're wondering how you ended up here, congratulations. You don't need to have done anything wrong. Roman authorities were refreshingly indiscriminate about who they enslaved. War prisoner, criminal, poor person standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, drunkard with unpaid debts, or maybe you just looked a little too smug for a centurion's liking. Bang, you're a galley slave. Rome's legal system had all the nuance of a hungry seagull. If someone needed to be punished, you could be sold to a galley master for a handful of denarii. No one asked too many questions. Which means you, dear viewer, in all your modern, shower-taking, Wi-Fi using, almond latte drinking glory, would last about 4 minutes in Roman society before winding up here. The dress code, rags, and regret. As for clothing, forget about it. You're either naked or in a ragged tunic so filthy it qualifies as its own ecosystem. Shoes? Not a chance. Chains don't go well with footwear. Jewelry? Only if you count the iron manacles now gracing your wrists and ankles. And if you had long hair or a beard when you arrived, it was probably shaved off. Romans weren't big on letting slaves have personal style choices. Your new co-workers. Let's meet the team. The guy to your left is missing 3 teeth and has an alarming facial twitch. To your right, a Gaul with homicidal eyes who probably murdered a tax collector. Behind you, someone is softly sobbing in a language you don't understand. The guy ahead of you is leaking some kind of unidentifiable bodily fluid, and all of you are equally miserable. The best case scenario is that no one bothers to kill you during your first shift. The worst case scenario? Well, let's get into that. Your daily schedule, a symphony of suffering. Morning. You wake up to the sting of a whip or the bellow of the overseer. No one cares if you slept. No one asks if you had breakfast, because you didn't. You might get a handful of moldy bread or a cup of something pretending to be water. Don't get excited. It's probably just recycled seawater with a hint of rat. Mid-morning to evening. Row. That's it. Row for hours on end to the beat of a drum. If you stop, slow down, or sneeze out of turn, a lash finds your back. There's no toilet break, no stretching session, no coffee run. You do everything, and I mean everything, right there on your bench. Night. If the ship isn't actively being pursued by pirates or hunting down merchant vessels, you might get a few hours of fitful sleep, usually while still chained to your bench, lying in a pool of your own sweat and whatever your bunkmate leaked during the day. Hygiene. Medieval level horror. Let's be clear. The Romans, for all their engineering brilliance, did not design galleys with sanitation in mind. The place is a living petri dish. Cuts get infected. Lice and fleas infest your clothes. Dysentery runs rampant. The air is so thick with humidity, blood, and mildew, you can practically chew it. If you get sick, tough luck. The Roman medical plan involves throwing you overboard before you infect the rest of the labor force. You'll be lucky if someone tosses you a rat to eat before that happens. Lesson 1. Never catch the eye of the overseer. Above all else, you do not want attention. The galley overseer, An embittered ex-legionary with one eye and half a soul lives for making examples out of people. Too slow, whip. Too fast, whip. Coughing, whip. Whimpering, double whip. Your goal is to become a piece of furniture. Not interesting, not memorable, a moving part of the ship no one thinks about. The rowing, it's worse than you think. Let's discuss the physical aspect. Ever tried rowing? Now imagine doing it for 12 hours, shackled with no food, in a space that's hotter than a sauna run by Satan himself. The oars are heavy, often waterlogged and poorly balanced. You're not rowing for exercise. You're propelling a warship armed with ballistae, on a mission to ram enemy boats and slaughter pirates. The drumbeat sets the pace, slow, fast, frenzied, whatever the situation calls for. At battle stations, you'll row until your muscles tear and your skin peels off your palms. And if you fall behind, the guy next to you will be punished too. That's right, group suffering is an ancient motivational tool. Entertainment options, none. Forget Netflix, forget books. Your only entertainment is watching the rats, counting the oar strokes until your heart gives out, inventing increasingly creative curses for the Romans. Occasionally, if you are lucky, you might witness a fellow slave making a desperate, suicidal break for the water. Most get cut down before they hit the deck. Meal times, loosely defined. When you do get food, it's whatever slop the quartermaster scrapes together. Gruel, stale bread, maybe dried beans if someone up top lost a bet. Water comes from a communal bucket you share with 100 other dying men. It's about as sanitary as licking a public doorknob. Your life expectancy, hilariously grim. The average lifespan of a galley slave, about 2 years if you're shockingly lucky. Most don't make it 6 months. Disease, exhaustion, accidents, or being chained to a sinking ship tend to take care of that. Lesson 2. Hope for a quick death. If a battle starts, you're better off getting skewered by an arrow than surviving. Because if the ship sinks, you're going down with it. Shackles don't float, and if you do miraculously escape, good luck surviving on whatever Roman coast you wash up on, with no money, no citizenship, and probably no working limbs. To be continued. In part 2, we'll dive into the types of punishments you can expect, what happens when a battle breaks out, and why you should never trust the guy who claims to have an escape plan. It only gets worse from here, folks. Part 2, blood, salt, and utter despair, daily life and death on a Roman slave galley. Alright, so you've survived your first grueling, sweat-soaked, blood-caked day chained to a wooden bench, rowing a Roman death barge through the Mediterranean. You've learned to keep your head down, not to sneeze out of rhythm, and to avoid eye contact with the twitchy ex-legionary holding the whip. Great job. Now it's time to see just how much worse this nightmare can get. Let's talk punishments. Spoiler, they're inventively horrible. If you thought your high school gym coach was cruel, allow me to introduce you to ancient Rome's aquatic HR department. There's a menu of punishments on board, and you will sample them whether you like it or not. The classic whip. Basic, reliable, timeless, delivered via a leather scourge, often embedded with bits of bone or metal to add some zing. It wasn't a warning. It was an immediate, vicious response to anything from coughing too loud to rowing a half-beat off tempo. The stocks. If you somehow managed to piss off your overseer without earning immediate death, you might find yourself locked in stocks on deck for public amusement. No shade, no water, and if a seagull pooped on you, congratulations. That's your lunch. The lash while rowing, a cruel favorite. Overseers loved flogging slaves while forcing them to keep rowing. Nothing says motivation like blood running down your back as you try to keep pace with a war drum set by a man who drinks vinegar for breakfast. The weighted overboard. Dunk. Part punishment, part entertainment. Offenders would have weights tied to their legs, then be dunked overboard and hauled up repeatedly until they either promised to do better, passed out, or drowned. The crowd was encouraged to cheer. Lesson 3. There are worse fates than death. Not all punishments ended with death. Some left you alive but wishing otherwise. Broken fingers, flayed backs, shattered ribs. And God help you if the Roman officer felt like making an example of someone. Naval combat, your personal apocalypse. But let's move on to the real highlight of your new career, battle. When your galley spotted an enemy vessel, pirates, rebels, or an unfortunate merchant ship carrying overpriced figs, the entire atmosphere on board shifted. The overseers would shout for battle pace, a frantic, relentless beat on the war drum, faster than any sane man could manage for more than a few minutes. Blood vessels burst in faces, palms split open, men vomited, but you kept rowing, because the alternative was the sharp end of a Roman sword, or worse, being chained to a sinking ship. Ramming speed galleys weren't known for their subtlety. The favored tactic was to charge head-on into the enemy ship, using a bronze battering ram mounted on the prow. You'd hear the command shouted over the drumbeats, "Ramming speed!" Then you and your miserable oarmates rowed like men possessed, knowing full well you might be part of the crew tearing through the enemy hull, or the poor souls on the other ship, about to be splintered and drowned. When the ship hits, the impact was catastrophic. Wood splintered, men screamed, debris exploded in all directions. If you were lucky, the oar you were chained to snapped clean off and you could dive for your life. If not, you might be pulled underwater by the wreckage, or impaled by flying timber. And remember, galleys didn't stop for cleanup. If your ship survived, it just kept moving, leaving the floating dead behind to become shark bait. Boarding parties, the bloodbath gets personal. Sometimes, rather than ramming, Roman galleys would grapple the enemy ship and launch a boarding party. That's when the screaming really started. You'd be left chained below while armored soldiers stormed the other deck, hacking and stabbing anything that moved. Blood dripped through the boards above you, the air filled with the smell of burning pitch, blood, and human waste. If your ship took heavy losses, the overseers might decide to recruit you into the melee. Congratulations, here's a rusted dagger or broken spear. Go die with honor, or more accurately, die in terror. Lesson 4. Battle was a lose-lose situation. If your side won, you were back to rowing within the hour. If your side lost, the victors either slaughtered you on the spot or chained you up and forced you to row their ship. It was a continuous, depressing game of musical chairs, except everyone's a hostage and the prize is malnutrition. Injuries and healthcare injuries on board weren't treated so much as ignored. Broken bones? Wrap a dirty rag around it and hope it stops moving. Infection? A quick amputation with a rusty knife. Fever? The ship's doctor, Red, the guy least afraid of blood, might recommend leeches or bloodletting, assuming you were worth the trouble. In most cases, the preferred treatment was a quiet shove overboard. Food, still not good meals, if you could call them that, remained appalling. Spoiled fish, weevil-infested bread, a ladle of watery gruel flavored with despair. Fresh water was scarce and usually tainted. If you caught dysentery, and you would, the options were continue rowing while violently ill, die. Escape plans universally idiotic. Every galley slave dreamed of escape. Some even whispered rumors of islands where runaway slaves lived like kings. Others plotted daring overboard leaps in the dead of night. The success rate for these plans was somewhere between none and less than none. Why? Because you were chained. You couldn't swim. Romans didn't teach slaves to swim for obvious reasons. The sea was full of sharks and angry Roman patrol ships. Even if you made it to land, you were a penniless foreigner with visible shackles and no papers in a world that considered you less valuable than a horse. Lesson 5. Hope was a luxury item. Some slaves clung to tiny scraps of hope. A miraculous storm, a kind-hearted centurion, being sold to a less murderous owner, most eventually abandoned those fantasies and accepted the crushing, bone-deep misery of their new life, religion and superstition. In the absence of salvation, superstition filled the void. Galley slaves invented their own curses, charms, and rituals. Some whispered prayers to Neptune, begging for a storm to capsize the ship. Others carried pebbles in their mouths for luck. A few believed that certain rats were sacred omens, and killing one would bring divine wrath. The Romans, of course, thought this was hilarious. Some officers even encouraged it, finding it amusing to see which desperate wretch believed a rotten fishbone was a holy relic. Your overseers, cartoon villains without the charm. The men responsible for your torment weren't complex characters. They were brutes with no empathy, no sense of humor, and no regard for human suffering. Most were ex-legionaries too violent or unstable for land duty. Their favorite hobbies included inventing new insults, competing over who could whip the most flesh in one afternoon, betting on which slave would die first during battle. One popular game involved forcing slaves to fight each other for scraps of food. Loser got a beating. Winner got slightly less of a beating. To be continued. Coming up in part 3, the absurd politics of Roman naval warfare, the sheer stupidity of ancient medical practices on board, and why your corpse might still have value even after your inevitable death. Part 3, war, medicine, and other insults to the human body. Welcome back, poor soul. You've somehow survived multiple battles, unspeakable meals, relentless beatings, and about 73 different species of vermin all fighting for real estate in your hair. At this point, you probably think you've experienced the worst a Roman slave galley has to offer. That's adorable. Because in this part, we're diving headfirst into the political absurdity of Roman naval warfare, the nightmarish excuse for medicine on board, and the bleak economic afterlife of your corpse. Roman naval politics, bureaucracy at sea. You might assume that galleys existed solely to chase pirates and haul cargo. Not so fast. The Roman Navy was also a floating playground for political favors, bribery, and jaw-dropping incompetence. Commanders weren't chosen for their tactical brilliance. They were usually appointed because they knew a senator's cousin, bought the job with a scandalous pile of denarii, were banished from the army for war crimes and needed somewhere to disappear. As a result, naval battles often devolved into chaotic, unplanned disasters orchestrated by men who thought left and starboard were flavors of wine. Battle orders from hell. You could find yourself rowing towards certain death because some idiot commander bet his life savings on a drunken wager that his ship was faster than a storm cloud, or because a Roman admiral wanted to impress a mistress in Alexandria by capturing 3 pirate ships before breakfast. Orders were vague, contradictory, or just plain insane. Row straight at the enemy and may Neptune sort them out was a legitimate tactic, and if your commander survived, it meant he was a hero. If not, well, guess who got blamed for not rowing fast enough? Lesson 6. Death was a management problem. If your ship went down, no one on land cared how or why. The governor's nephew would quietly appoint a new admiral, and the world kept spinning. The sea would claim your body, and your name would become a footnote in some bored scribe's record. Shipboard medicine, the real horror show. Let's talk healthcare. On paper, Roman galleys had a medicus, a so-called doctor whose qualifications typically included owning a rusty knife, knowing how to bleed a man without killing him too quickly, being the least seasick person on board. Medical care involved 3 primary techniques: cauterizing wounds with red-hot irons, often on the same plank you slept on, amputating limbs with a carpenter's saw, preferably while the ship was moving in high surf, administering herbal concoctions with names like wolf's bane porridge or vomit root elixir. Anesthetics? No. Pain relief? A sharp stick to bite down on, if you were lucky. Fever, infection, and pestilence fever was rampant. Infection spread through the ship faster than gossip in a Roman bathhouse. The only treatment for fever was isolation, meaning they'd toss you into a sun-baked corner of the hold and let you cook in your own sweat. Most infections ended in death, which was convenient because your economic afterlife, corpse with benefits. Even in death, you remained useful. Roman naval logistics were ruthlessly practical. If you died mid-voyage, you might be stripped of usable clothing, what little there was, fed to the rats, gulls, and fish, burned on a crude pyre when the smell became unbearable. But here's the twisted part. If your ship made port, your body might be sold to local physicians for dissection practice. Romans had a morbid fascination with human anatomy, and slave corpses made convenient teaching tools. Some shady merchants even bottled fat rendered from burned slaves, claiming it cured everything from gout to snakebite. Your remains might literally end up as medicine, a disturbing end to an already wretched life. Lesson 7. Even death was monetized. You didn't own your life, your body, or your dignity. Why would your corpse be any different? Divine superstitions of the sea in desperation, some slaves clung to superstition. Certain oarsmen believed that if you died gripping your oar, your soul would escape servitude and ascend to Elysium. Others swore that carrying a fish scale in your mouth protected you from drowning. Romans themselves had their own maritime gods, Neptune of course, but also lesser spirits who supposedly guarded ships and cursed incompetence. It didn't matter. The sea claimed believers and skeptics alike. Your new reality, permanent fear. By now you lived in a constant state of terror, fear of disease, fear of battle, fear of your overseer, fear of hunger, fear of being sold to an even worse ship. And trust me, there were worse ships. Hope became a liability. Dreaming of freedom got people killed. The smartest survivors learned to stop thinking past the next oar stroke. Lesson 8. Numbness was self-preservation. To endure, you shut down everything but your arms and your ears. You learn the drum beat, the commands, the sting of the whip. Everything else blurred into a salt-streaked haze of repetition. Entertainment, a muted kind of madness. Insanity was a common occupational hazard. Some slaves started whispering to themselves. Others sang songs in dead languages. A few crafted tiny figures from splinters and named them after Roman gods, praying to their crude totems in the shadows. It was a culture of quiet, personal madness. 1,000 tiny rebellions in a floating prison, the overseer's favorite pastime. Overseers, those delightful specimens of humanity, entertained themselves by inventing punishments and organizing sadistic games. One favorite involved forcing 2 slaves to fight over a crust of bread. The loser was tossed overboard. The winner sometimes was too. Betting on who would die in battle, lose an eye to infection, or simply snap and start gnawing on his own oar was another popular pastime. To be continued. Coming up in part 4, how entire crews died in storms and why no one batted an eye. The final hilariously terrible options available if you somehow made it to old age. And the truly insulting way history forgot you existed at all. Because on a Roman galley, even your memory was disposable. Stay tuned, because the worst is yet to come. Part 4, Storms, Obscurity, and the Final Insult of History. Welcome back, survivor. If you're still here, it means you've outlived dysentery, Roman naval politics, shipboard plague, psychotic overseers, and a death toll that would make the Grim Reaper politely ask for a coffee break. And yet, as much as you'd love for this misery cruise to be nearing its end, it isn't, because the Roman slave galley had one last set of tricks up its blood-stained, salt-stiffened sleeve. Let's talk about storms, the indignity of growing old on a warship, and how the history books made damn sure to forget you ever existed. The Mediterranean, kindly referred to as the drowning pit. Ancient Roman galleys weren't exactly designed for comfort, durability, or basic safety. They were built for speed and brutality, and when the weather turned ugly, these flat-bottomed, overloaded death traps handled like wooden kites in a hurricane. Storms weren't seasonal inconveniences. They were constant, unpredictable, and completely catastrophic. You might spend months roasting in the sun, only to be hit with a surprise squall so vicious it snapped masts and turned rowers into waterlogged corpses before anyone could yell, "Neptune, preserve us." Lesson 9. Nature hated you too. If the storm hit during daylight, you got to witness firsthand the terrifying sight of towering waves and pitch-black clouds closing in. If it came at night, and it often did, you'd wake up to the ship tilting at impossible angles, the drum drowned out by shrieking wind and men praying, vomiting, and defecating simultaneously. And you kept rowing, chained to your bench, soaking wet, blinded by salt spray, skin flayed raw by oar handles, muscles already quivering from days of exertion. Stopping meant punishment, drowning meant salvation. When a galley sank, if a galley went under, it went fast. These ships weren't built to absorb damage. They cracked like egg cartons under serious pressure. And here's the cheerful detail. The oars themselves acted like spears when a ship capsized, driving through the men chained to them. You might think, but surely they unlocked the chains in a storm. No, friend, those chains stayed on. Roman officers figured it was safer to lose a few dozen slaves than risk a mass escape in the chaos. If the ship sank, you went down with it. Problem solved. Rescue, that's a cute idea. Nearby ships did not stop to pick up survivors, not because they were heartless, though they were, but because every spare man was needed to row, steer, or bail water out of their own doomed vessel. A drowning man was dead weight, and Rome's navy did not tolerate dead weight unless it was ballast. Lesson 10. The ocean didn't care. At best, your body became driftwood. At worst, you were food for whatever monstrous things lurked beneath the Mediterranean waves. The sea took your name, your corpse, and your final gasp without a single ripple of regret. Growing old on a galley, the ultimate bad retirement plan. Let's pretend, by some deranged miracle, you weren't killed in battle, flogged to death, diseased into oblivion, or swallowed by a storm. What then? You might imagine a slave galley had some retirement system. A thanks for 20 years of unpaid backbreaking labor card and a small goat to tend on some quiet hill. Wrong. You rowed until you physically couldn't. Once you were too weak or sick to hold an oar, you were tossed overboard, sold to a brothel as a novelty sideshow, or simply left to die on a dockside somewhere, penniless, diseased, and invisible. Old age wasn't respected on a galley. It was considered a logistical inconvenience. Lesson 11. No one left a legacy. Roman galley slaves didn't leave memoirs. No statues were built in their honor. No songs were sung. If you think history preserved tales of heroism and brotherhood among oarsmen, you're dead wrong. Even among slaves, galley rowers were considered the lowest, most disposable rung. Your name, your story, your face, all erased the moment you died. You became a statistic in the background of someone else's military triumph. History's favorite insult, erasure. Here's the final, stinging insult. Most Roman historians didn't even bother recording the names of slave crews. Battles were described in lavish detail. The general's speeches lovingly transcribed. The number of enemy ships burned tallied like party favors, but not a single thought given to the thousands of men chained beneath those decks. To them, you weren't part of history. You were a resource, a line item on a manifest, a necessary but embarrassing reminder that Rome's victories were built on the broken backs of nameless labor, the graveyard of ghosts. The Mediterranean floor is littered with ancient shipwrecks. Archaeologists find galleys all the time, shattered hulls, rusted bronze rams, piles of amphorae. Rarely do they find remains of the men who powered those ships. Sometimes, bones surface, chained to bits of rotten wood, a skeleton gripping a rusted oar, fused by centuries of salt and silt. No one knows their names, no one mourns. Tourists snap pictures, guides tell stories of brave Roman sailors, and somewhere a whisper of the real suffering flickers and fades. Lesson 12. The best you could hope for was to be forgotten. On a Roman galley, your only real escape was oblivion. Freedom was an unattainable fantasy. Revenge was a death sentence. Recognition was impossible. But being forgotten? That was achievable. It was the one mercy the sea offered. When you drowned, your name vanished. No debt, no lash, no overseer. Just cold water and silence. If you could time travel, don't. If any of you out there ever build a time machine, let me offer you a word of advice. Skip the Roman slave galley era entirely. Sure, ancient Rome had great architecture, philosophy, and some very amusing public orgies. But for the average man at the oar, it was a living hell of unimaginable cruelty, zero reward, and a death so meaningless history couldn't even be bothered to footnote it. Final lesson. History's greatest crimes are its quietest. It's easy to remember emperors and gladiators. Easy to romanticize legions marching under the eagle standard. Harder to acknowledge the thousands of invisible, unmarked graves littering the paths of ancient empires. Every glorious naval victory Rome claimed was paid for in the lives of men whose only crime was existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. And on a galley, death wasn't noble, it wasn't brave, it was an afterthought. The end of the oar. And so, dear viewers, we reach the final beat of our war drum. You've now felt the splinters, the salt burns, the suffocating air of a Roman slave galley. You've learned that survival was a coin toss, and that even your corpse would be bartered for scraps. If there's one takeaway here, it's this. No matter how bad your job is today, unless you're literally chained to a rotting bench rowing a 400-ton death trap, through storm-infested waters while an armed psychopath screams Latin slurs at you, you're doing alright. So raise a glass to your own good fortune, and maybe pour one out for the countless lost, nameless souls whose only monument is the broken timbers of a sunken ship. I'll see you next time for another cheerful historical nightmare. Stay alive out there. Quick question for you. Ever felt like your modern job is slowly draining your soul one pointless meeting at a time? Thought about ditching it all, moving somewhere exotic, and becoming one with nature? Well, let me save you the trouble. Because today, we're traveling back to the lush, humid, insect-infested jungles of the ancient Maya lowlands to show you exactly why you wouldn't last a single day as a farmer there. Spoiler alert, your biggest problem won't be the backbreaking labor. It'll be everything else. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Part 1, Welcome to the Jungle, and Immediate Regret. So, you wake up. It's the year 730 CE, the classic period of Maya civilization, a time when towering limestone cities gleamed in the jungle canopy and kings performed human sacrifices like it was open mic night at the Blood Temple. You, however, are not a noble, a priest, or even a warrior. You are a farmer, which is a polite way of saying human draft animal. You stretch your aching limbs and immediately get bitten by 3 mosquitoes the size of small birds. The air is so humid it feels like you're breathing through a wet wool blanket. Welcome to the Maya Lowlands, where the weather is set permanently to unbearably swampy. Your job description, glorified mud shoveler. As a Maya farmer, your main job is simple: grow maize. And by grow maize, I mean spend 14 hours a day hacking through dense jungle, digging crude irrigation ditches, and praying to whichever bloodthirsty deity is responsible for rainfall. You also grow beans, squash, chili peppers, and occasionally cacao, if your overlords haven't already claimed the good fields for themselves. There's no plow, no oxen, no wheel. It's just you, a sharp stone blade, and the eternal oppressive heat. If you were thinking you'd be some peaceful agrarian sipping cacao under a palm tree, I regret to inform you that you are a walking callus covered in bug bites, your new neighbors, insects, and death. Let's take a moment to appreciate your new environment. The Maya Lowlands are one of the most ecologically diverse and aggressively hostile places on Earth. Your neighbors include venomous snakes, flesh-burrowing parasites, jaguars with an attitude problem, and enough disease-carrying insects to stock a medieval apothecary. Malaria? Check. Dengue fever? Naturally. Intestinal worms? Absolutely. You haven't truly lived until you've experienced every orifice on your body, attempting to evacuate itself simultaneously while you're supposed to be harvesting maize. Lesson 1. You will sweat until you die. There's no escaping the heat. It's 90 degrees Fahrenheit before sunrise and only gets worse from there. Shade is a myth, water is scarce and often filled with amoebas whose entire evolutionary purpose is to assassinate your intestines. You'll be expected to work dawn to dusk, with a break for a handful of cold maize porridge, and, if you're lucky, a tiny piece of fish or iguana meat. Hydration is whatever stagnant puddle you can find, which also serves as a breeding ground for disease and home to a frog that wants to murder you. Your diet, the great maize monotony. Maize isn't just a crop, it's a religion. It's the main ingredient in your gruel, your tortillas, your tamales, and your questionable fermented drinks. The problem? It's virtually all you eat. The human body, it turns out, wasn't designed to survive on nothing but corn mush and hope. Nutritional deficiencies are rampant. You'll develop conditions like pellagra, a horrifying disease caused by a lack of niacin that turns your skin to leather and makes you hallucinate jaguar gods coming for your soul. Protein? Rare. Fruit? Seasonal. Spices? If you're lucky. By day 5, you'll have a craving for a McChicken, so intense you'd sell your entire extended family for one. Your boss, a man with a knife and zero chill. Maya society was rigidly hierarchical. At the top was the Kuhul Aja, or Holy Lord, who wore an alarming amount of jade jewelry and got high on hallucinogenic enemas. Below him were nobles, priests, scribes, warriors, and at the very bottom, you, the farmer. And while you might not personally meet the king, you will meet his tax collector. Spoiler, he's not the forgiving type. Your job is to grow enough maize not only to feed your family, but to pay tribute in the form of grain, cacao, woven cloth, and occasionally your eldest child. Come up short, and it's not a polite letter or a fine. It's a swift visit from the local enforcer, who might confiscate your tools, torch your milpa, field, or drag you off for use in the next sacrificial bloodletting. Lesson 2. There are no labor rights. You can't unionize. You can't quit. The only severance package is literal severance of your head. The Maya elite believed the gods demanded a steady stream of human blood, and farmers made convenient offerings. You might think, but surely they'd pick criminals or captured warriors first. And yes, but when demand was high, no one was off limits. Plague, drought, or political power moves meant even you could be hauled up a temple pyramid, given a complimentary enema to purify your soul, and have your chest split open with an obsidian blade, so your still beating heart could be offered to the sun. Housing, less than rustic. Your home is a one-room thatched hut made of mud and reeds. No windows, no floor, no plumbing. Every insect within a 10-mile radius considers it their vacation property. At night, you sleep on a woven mat that smells faintly of mildew and despair. Mosquitoes form a humming cloud over your head. If it rains, and it will, your roof leaks. If it doesn't, the heat is suffocating. If you've managed to keep a fire going, congratulations. Now you're choking on smoke too. Family life, brief and tragic. Your wife works as hard as you do, carrying water, grinding maize, weaving textiles, and raising a small army of sickly, barefoot children. Infant mortality is so high that people often wait until a kid reaches 5 years old before bothering to name them. Your children will start working in the fields as soon as they can stand upright, and if they survive long enough, they'll inherit your spot in this ongoing festival of misery. Lesson 3. Everything is trying to kill you. The jungle? Murderous. Your diet? Inadequate. The government? Violent and capricious. The weather? Swampy apocalypse. Your neighbors? Equally miserable and likely to sell you out if it saves them a beating. And yet, against all odds, the Maya built cities with pyramids taller than European cathedrals and astronomers who could predict eclipses centuries in advance. They achieved feats of engineering and art while you, the poor bastard farmer, spent your life ankle-deep in mud, cursing the sun. And this was just the good times. To be continued. In part 2, we'll explore the horrors of slash-and-burn agriculture. What happens when drought hits, and how the Maya elite found new and exciting ways to make your short, miserable life even shorter. Trust me, it only gets worse from here. Part 2, Fire, Drought, and the Sacred Art of Suffering. So, you've managed to sweat your way through your first day in the Maya lowlands without being bitten by a venomous snake, sacrificed on a temple altar, or dying of heat stroke. Congratulations, you've earned yourself the right to wake up tomorrow and do it all over again. Except this time, things are about to get even more aggressively awful. Today's topics: how you farm in a jungle that actively wants you dead, what happens when the rain stops, and why your misery is considered a holy obligation. Slash and burn: how to make bad land worse. Let's start with your job, which is farming. Now, farming in the Maya lowlands isn't like farming in some picturesque European valley. This is dense, swampy jungle terrain. The soil, thin and exhausted, the weather, either monsoon or drought, with a brief intermission called heat so intense your teeth sweat. The Maya method of agriculture was known as milpa, or slash and burn. Step 1. Hack down an area of jungle using a dull stone axe while swatting away centipedes the size of your forearm. Step 2. Wait for everything to dry out in the humid air that somehow never actually dries anything. Step 3. Set it on fire. The goal is to burn the undergrowth and trees, releasing nutrients into the soil. Sounds clever, right? Until you realize that after a season or two, the soil's nutrients are gone, and you have to do it again somewhere else. Which means more hacking, more burning, and more begging the gods not to curse your maze. Lesson 4. The jungle always wins. No matter how much you burn, clear, or dig, the jungle comes back. Vines creep over your fields. Insects invade your stored grain. Predators lurk at the edges of your cleared land, waiting for the chance to grab a child or livestock. And the heat, it never lets up. By midday, the air is so thick it feels like drinking soup through your lungs. You sweat out every drop of water you drank before breakfast, and no, there's no cold stream nearby. Only tepid, frog-infested puddles and rain-filled clay pots that smell like old feet. The dry season, nature's way of saying, screw you. Now, imagine doing all this while there's no rain, because for several months of the year, the rains stop, the rivers shrink, the ponds turn to mud, the crops wither, the animals die. You and your family start to look longingly at that one skinny chicken in the corner. The problem is, you can't eat the chicken yet because you might need it for a sacrifice, or to pay tribute, or because it's literally the last living thing in your village not visibly decomposing. The drought famine, double combo. When the drought stretches on, it's not just your village, it's the whole region. Trade routes dry up, cacao shipments stop, City-states start blaming each other for angering the gods. This is when the priesthood kicks into high gear, organizing massive blood sacrifices to bring the rain back. Guess whose names might get pulled from the expendable offerings jar? Lesson 5. Hope is a weapon. In Maya society, religion wasn't a comfort. It was a weapon. The priesthood held absolute power over the terrified masses. Droughts and disasters were blamed on the people's collective failure to properly honor the gods. More blood was demanded, first from captured enemies, then criminals, then volunteers, usually people so desperate for food they offered themselves, and finally from everyday folks like you. The message was clear: suffer harder, work more, bleed faster, and maybe, you'll earn a single cloud's worth of mercy. Religious festivals, good for the nobles, bad for you. While you starved, the city's nobles threw grand festivals. Hundreds of captives were marched up temple pyramids, their hearts cut out, their blood poured down stone steps while the elite feasted on roasted peccary and drank cacao spiced with chili. You got to watch from a distance, stomach growling, wondering if that one writhing, blood-soaked figure was the neighbor you hated for always stealing your water. Disease, the eternal companion. Between the heat, poor diet, and endless labor, your immune system was as flimsy as your mud brick hut. Malaria, intestinal parasites, dysentery, and things so disgusting they don't have modern names ran rampant. Medical treatment involved herbal poultices, ritual chanting, and, if things got bad, bloodletting with stingray spines shoved under your fingernails. That headache you've had for 2 days? Probably worms. That rash? Jungle rot? That coughing child? Dead by morning. Lesson 6. Death was casual life. Expectancy wasn't measured in years, but in harvests. Make it through one planting and one drought without starving or being sacrificed? You were already ahead of the curve. Children died often. Old age was rare. Injury meant slow, agonizing death, because even a simple cut could turn septic in the humid, bacteria-rich environment. And when someone did pass, they were often buried under the family home, because graveyards were a luxury of the wealthy. Daily life, a marathon of misery. Your day started before sunrise. You worked until dusk. The briefest break came during the hottest part of the afternoon, when you'd collapse under a tree, chug some muddy water, and chew on a scrap of roasted squash. Then it was back to the field. No weekends. No holidays unless you counted religious events that might end with your decapitation. At night, you returned to your sweltering hut, where sleep was impossible because of mosquitoes, heat, and the constant threat of jaguars. The only entertainment was listening to your neighbors argue or your children cough themselves to death. Lesson 7. There's no such thing as retirement. You didn't save up for old age. You didn't plan for the future. You worked until your body failed. Then you either became a beggar, a sacrifice, or fertilizer. Your retirement plan was literally to be buried in the same field you broke your back cultivating. To be continued. Coming up in part 3, the horror of neighbor warfare and night raids. How the elite casually conscripted you for city-building projects you didn't survive. And the wonderfully deranged world of ritual enemas, bloodletting, and why your pain was a spectator sport. Yes, it somehow gets worse. Stay tuned. Part 3. Warfare, enemas, and building pyramids. You'll die. And congratulations. If you've made it this far, you're now an experienced Maya farmer, which means you're deeply malnourished, chronically sleep-deprived, half-crazed from jungle rot, and possess a personal vendetta against the sun. But wait, your life of barely surviving on maize mush and dodging venomous reptiles is about to take a charming new turn. Because if you thought drought and dysentery were bad, let's talk about what happens when your neighboring village decides it wants your land, your crops, and your children. Spoiler, no one sends a polite warning letter. Welcome to surprise warfare. Maya warfare wasn't about conquering vast territories or ideological crusades. It was personal. Petty disputes between city-states and villages could erupt into violent raids over a stolen wife, a botched trade deal, or someone insulting a king's weirdly elaborate headdress. And you, the farmer, were right on the front lines, because your flimsy, thatched roof hut was conveniently located between the elite city centers and the dense, unforgiving jungle. Lesson 8. Your hut is a fire hazard and a target. When enemy warriors came, they didn't storm city walls first. No, they started with your farm. Why? Because burning fields, stealing food, and abducting peasants made excellent pre-battle rituals and guaranteed your city would be too weak and hungry to fight back effectively. Night raids were common. You'd be asleep, or more accurately, lying half-conscious on your sweat-drenched mat, swatting mosquitoes off your face, when suddenly someone would kick down your door, set your house on fire, and drag your family off screaming into the dark. If you were lucky, you were killed quickly. If not, you were taken as a prisoner, marched barefoot for days, and either enslaved, sacrificed, or used as lev bait for crocodiles. Elite warfare, a blood sport for the rich. Official battles were even worse. Maya elites loved ritual combat. Entire city-states would agree to battle dates, sometimes holding them on sacred holidays for maximum drama. Your king, high on hallucinogenic toad venom and his own ego, would rally a handful of warriors while the rest of you, yes, the farmers, would be conscripted as cannon fodder. You were given a stick, a rock, or if you were very lucky, a crude obsidian-tipped club, armor. Not unless you counted your own thick, sun-leathered skin. Lesson 9. You weren't expected to win. See, Maya warfare wasn't about slaughtering the enemy. It was about taking captives. Captives meant sacrificial victims, ransom money, or prestige. Killing was considered wasteful unless absolutely necessary. So the enemy was actively trying to maim you, disable you, and haul you off alive. Of course, the side effect of this policy was that even if you survived battle, you'd be left half dead, missing a chunk of your face, and probably wishing you died outright. Aftermath. More work, less pay. If your side won the skirmish, great. Back to the fields. Now with fewer hands to help and a higher tribute demand, because the king needed more offerings to thank the gods for victory. If your side lost, expect your fields torched, your harvest stolen, and your town's surviving population sold into slavery. The conscription lottery. Pyramid duty. Now, let's assume you've avoided being sacrificed, enslaved, or gutted like a fish during a night raid. You'd think you could crawl back to your maize fields and spend your remaining miserable years arguing with your neighbors about whose corn was taller. Wrong, because your city is always building something. A new pyramid, a ball court, an astronomical observatory no one asked for, and guess who gets to haul 100-pound limestone blocks up 1,000 steps in the blistering sun? You. Lesson 10. Public works were death sentences. The Maya were brilliant architects. They built colossal pyramids, towering stelae, and intricate causeways. But unlike in modern history books, it wasn't skilled artisans doing the grunt labor. It was you and your equally cursed neighbors. You worked barefoot, hauling stone, mixing lime mortar with your bare hands and eyes, because protective gear didn't exist, and dying from crushed limbs, heat exhaustion, and poisonous dust inhalation. And the best part? You weren't paid. You were offering labor to the gods. The gods, in turn, offered you back-to-back funerals and an afterlife as a glorified houseplant spirit. Religious rituals, pain as public entertainment. At this point, you might be thinking, at least I'm not a noble dealing with politics and sacrifice decisions. Oh, friend, you're about to get an up-close front-row seat to ritual pain. Maya religious ceremonies were spectacularly gruesome, and as a peasant, you were legally obligated to attend. Failing to show up meant accusations of blasphemy, which meant bloodletting, flogging, or being tied to an anthill and covered in honey. Lesson 11. Religious hygiene was worse than no hygiene. The Maya believed the gods demanded constant physical suffering. Bloodletting was a holy act. Nobles pierced their tongues, lips, and even genitals with obsidian blades to offer blood to the gods. You, as a peasant, were sometimes expected to participate on certain feast days. A priest with visibly blood-stained hands would slice your earlobe or tongue with a stingray spine and collect the drips in a bowl. If you fainted, you were mocked. If you resisted, you were executed. Hallucinogenic rituals and enemas. No, seriously no. Ancient culture did bizarre ritual intoxication quite like the Maya. Hallucinogens were central to contacting the gods, usually delivered via enemas. Yes, you read that correctly. The elite would mix a potent cocktail of fermented honey, morning glory seeds, tobacco juice, and various jungle plants into a thick, noxious sludge, then administer it the fastest way into the bloodstream, rectally. Why? Because apparently, if you're going to talk to bloodthirsty corn gods while vomiting your soul out, you might as well be high enough to believe it's a good idea. As a peasant, you wouldn't get the fancy drugs. You might be forced to drink or sniff some truly horrific herbal brews that made you violently ill. then stagger around a ritual plaza while priests claimed your delirium was a vision. Lesson 12. Death was a public spectacle. Human sacrifice wasn't private, it was theater. Thousands of peasants like you packed the main plaza to watch prisoners have their hearts torn out or be thrown down temple steps like sacks of old vegetables. You cheered because not cheering was suspicious, and you wanted to see it because it meant one more person died instead of you. But secretly, you knew that the next drought, raid, or harvest failure could put you in the spotlight, and no one would shed a tear. To be continued. Coming up in part 4, why even dying wasn't the end of your problems, how your body could be turned into fertilizer, a religious relic, or left to rot in a swamp, and how modern historians romanticize all of this while quietly ignoring the fact that you lived like a sun-baked, worm-riddled, disposable labor unit. Yes, it gets even darker. See you there. Part 4, Death After Death and the Final Insult of History. Alright, you've been sweating through the jungle heat, hacking through mosquito swarms, dodging night raids, sacrificing your own blood to vengeful gods, and hauling pyramid stones until your spine resembles a question mark. Surely you're thinking, at least when I die, the suffering stops. Friend, you really don't know how this works, do you? In the Maya Lowlands, death was not the end of your nightmare. It was just the start of a whole new realm of undignified misery, and that's what we're diving into today. Lesson 13. Death was expensive, and you couldn't afford it. Let's start with the basics. Dying wasn't free. If you were a noble, your corpse was wrapped in fine textiles, stuffed full of jade beads and cacao beans for the afterlife, and placed inside a limestone tomb beneath a pyramid, while mourners wept dramatically. You? No such luck. As a dirt-smeared, malnourished, parasite-riddled farmer, your options were limited. If you died during a drought, your body was probably left where you fell because nobody had time to dig a hole. If you croaked during one of the endless festivals, congratulations. You might get tossed into a communal fire pit, or, if you were lucky, a shallow grave behind the maize field. Grave markers? None. Names? Forgotten. You were basically ancient compost, your body's possible posthumous careers. And depending on circumstances, you might get recycled. The Maya were nothing if not practical. If you died on a construction project, your body might be stuffed into the foundation of the building as an offering to stabilize the structure. If you died in a particularly holy month, priests might extract your bones to make ritual instruments. If you were sacrificed, your skull might become a ceremonial drinking cup, so even in death you were still useful to someone else. Lesson 14. Xibalba. The Maya afterlife was not a vacation. Unlike the modern idea of a gentle afterlife full of soft clouds and harp music, the Maya believed in Xibalba, the place of fear. It was a subterranean hellscape ruled by a charming bunch of death gods with names like Rotting Corpse Lord and Demon of Sudden Death. Xibalba was filled with tests designed by a pantheon of deities whose hobby was coming up with creative new ways to torture souls. We're talking rivers of blood, deadly scorpions, rooms filled with razors, and games rigged to guarantee your failure. And yes, as a peasant, you were automatically ticketed for this horrifying theme park. Good deaths were rare. There were a few good deaths in Maya belief: dying in childbirth, being sacrificed, or dying in battle. These could fast-track you to a nicer afterlife. But since you'd spent your entire life trying to avoid being sacrificed and desperately hiding from conscription, odds are your death was from infection, starvation, or being flattened by a falling limestone block, which meant you got the Xibalba Express ticket. Lesson 15. The afterlife was just more labor. And the best part, in Xibalba, you didn't get to rest. The underworld was a bureaucratic labyrinth where you spent eternity suffering, working off your worldly failings, and navigating trials designed to humiliate you. Think of it as the world's worst unpaid internship, but forever. Your family's reaction: shrug. Since life was so fragile, death was casual. Infant mortality was so common, parents didn't even name their kids until they'd survived several rainy seasons. When you died, your family mourned briefly, usually because now there were fewer hands to work the field, and moved on. Your hut was either claimed by a relative, abandoned to the jungle, or burned as a sacrifice, and you were rapidly forgotten. Lesson 16. Even the gods didn't care. You might be tempted to think, well, surely the gods noticed my devotion, my bloodletting, my endless labor. Nope. The gods were essentially celestial narcissists. Their hunger for blood, pain, and offerings was insatiable, and your death didn't even register. You were one of tens of thousands of farmers, a face in a sea of sweating, suffering nobodies. The gods got your blood, the elite got your crops, and the earth got your corpse. Archaeological evidence, yep, it was that bad. Modern excavations of Maya cities and rural settlements confirm how disposable peasants were. Most burials were shallow, unmarked, and often layered on top of one another, like organic lasagna. Mass graves of war captives and laborers have been uncovered, along with evidence of fatal injuries, malnutrition, and brutal work conditions. Charred bones, broken skulls, and sacrificial remains littered temple complexes like ancient garbage. And the nobility? Entombed with jade necklaces, feather cloaks, and stone carvings of themselves being awesome. Lesson 17. History pretends you didn't exist. When modern people think of the Maya, they imagine gleaming pyramids, sophisticated calendars, and eerily precise astronomical predictions. Nobody thinks about the thousands of peasants it took to feed, build, and bleed for that civilization. Textbooks and travel documentaries lovingly describe Maya ball games and jade jewelry, rarely pausing to mention the farmers who broke their bodies growing maize for a class of priest kings tripping on hallucinogenic enemas. You won't find your name in inscriptions. No temple was built in your honor. No poem mourns your passing. In the eyes of history, you were a tool, no more relevant than a discarded digging stick. Your legacy, mosquito food. After your death, your bones rotted. The jungle reclaimed your home. The next generation built a new hut over your remains. And so the cycle continued, an unbroken chain of human suffering stretching across centuries, ensuring that sacred cities could shine in the canopy while ordinary men and women died anonymously in the dirt. Lesson 18. The modern romanticism lie. Today, people visit Maya ruins and wax poetic about lost wisdom and mystical energy. They forget that those towering pyramids were built by exhausted peasants laboring under the threat of the whip. New Age tourists meditate atop blood-soaked altars, unaware that beneath their yoga mats lie the crushed bones of countless farmers who worked themselves to death. We romanticize ancient cultures because the past feels safely distant, but the truth is, for the average person, in the Maya Lowlands, in Rome, in medieval Europe, history wasn't grand or glorious. It was a daily fight against heat, hunger, disease, and arbitrary violence. Final lesson, you wouldn't last a day. So if you still believe you could go off-grid and thrive in a bygone society, let this be your wake-up call. You wouldn't last a day, not because you're weak or soft or can't handle hardship, but because the past didn't care. It chewed up everyone, noble or peasant, until only stone ruins and the occasional jade necklace remained, and the jungle always wins in the end. The end. So, to all of you modern peasants stuck in office cubicles, enduring endless Zoom calls, or sweating through your 9 to 5, be grateful. At least you're not being sacrificed to top a pyramid while your heart's still beating. Yet. See you next time for another cheerful historical horror story. Stay alive out there.